Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to 360 Church at the Shattuck Cinemas, and happy Father's Day to you. If you haven't sent your dad a call or a text, I'll give you official permission to do that during the sermon this morning. So grab your phone and tell Dad that you love him, because I'm sure he's thinking about you today. This week, I spent some time trying to find out who is the smartest person who has ever lived, insofar as we can know that. And so I was researching this for quite a while, and I came up with, you know, the internet is loaded with top 10 of everything. I came up with these top 10 lists of who the smartest people ever are, and one of them that popped right to the top of Google, which means it's the absolute universal certainty in the universe if it gets to the top of the first page. The smartest person who has ever lived is Nikola Tesla. You know, the Tesla car factory that's right down the road on 580 in Fremont, I believe it is. He is supposed to be the number one most genius person ever. I wondered, if you're so smart, why your electric cars cost so much that I can't afford one. But they said he was the smartest guy. Now, Jesus is on the list too, but he only comes in at number 4, 2 slots ahead of Hitler. So I thought, I'm not so sure that this list business is really, you know, the way to go when we're trying to define who really has it going on in terms of mental acumen. I did discover a lot of great genius trivia, though. Like only by IQ measurement, about 0.5% of the population would qualify for that label. Among them is actor James Woods, who has an IQ of 180. And there's a former television writer who has disappeared into hippiedom that is up over 200. I mean, the kind of thing where after you die, they'd have to give your brain to the Smithsonian in a glass jar because no one else ever had one like this. Einsteinian intelligence seems to be out there. And I read the list, read another list. I came to a couple of conclusions. One is, I am on none of these lists, and neither is anyone that I know. And so I'm really struggling with having kind of a comparison or an association or a way to relate to this, because I just don't know anybody who's there. And it began to clarify for me that given the types of people on the list, a lot of them are scientists, it seems like there's a difference between what IQ measures and what it is to be wise. Because I'm not really so sure how wise everyone who is so smart turns out to be. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that you can be smart or you can be great. And I saw a lot of smartness on these lists, and in terms of greatness, sort of mixed results. Now, there's one man in history that combined them both. His name is Solomon. He is the 3rd king of the nation of Israel. He reigned in about 3,000 years ago, and he started out only being famous for being the son of David, who was the most famous king prior to him. Solomon's story is told in the Old Testament. He's also mentioned in the Quran as one of the major prophets, where most Muslims refer to him by the Arabic version of his name, which is Suleiman, son of David. He's noted there, and in the Old Testament, his story is recorded in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, which gives a detailed account of his life. He is the overlord of what has become a regional empire that sits right on top of all the major trade routes of his day, largely supported by the fact that the other countries around him are in a state of weakness and decline. He's done pretty well. You know, if everybody around you is a loser, you can look like a winner without too much trouble. That is the story of this guy. When he starts, let's face it, he's the boss's son. He's the son of the most famous guy that anyone has ever known in this nation, and no one around him is any threat. And so probably word on the street is, well, yeah, he seems pretty smart and he has dreams from God and stuff, but really he's not up against very stiff competition. So how good is he really? His military power isn't really the key to his reputation. The key is that he's beginning to become known as a man who is extremely wise, not just smart, but wise. And 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 23 sketches in a little of the background of what that meant to King Solomon. It says, "Thus King Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. Every one of them brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, myrrh, spices, horses, and mules." There's a present I'm really looking for. So much year by year. Now, this is the month of wisdom at 360 Church. We're parked on top of the life of Solomon for all of the month of June. And I believe in my heart that this is going to be a month when tangled problems become untangled, when complicated situations in our lives become simple, and when big question marks turn into exclamation points, because God's given us some answers for some crazy stuff that's just maybe driving you nuts. This is a month where we should believe that God is going to show us what we need to know and how we need to know it to get all of this sorted out. Now, first week of the series, we talked about wisdom's emergence, that it comes from a humility that turns to God and asks for it the way the king did. And then last week, we talked about wisdom's enigma, which is Solomon's confrontation with two prostitutes who bring him a baby, both claiming that it is their child. He says, "Bring me a sword," as if threatening to cut the baby in half. And what it really does is makes the woman who is the real mother say, "No, I'd rather have the baby given away than have the baby killed." And so rather than the sword being an instrument of violence, it becomes an instrument for breaking down the conventions of his social system, stepping outside them, and bringing life instead of bringing death. You know, speaking of a couple prostitutes, it's amazing how much of this king's life is shaped by women. Bathsheba, his mother, one of David's wives, is the one who behind the scenes has maneuvered Solomon into the position of becoming king in the first place. The encounter with the two prostitutes demonstrates that his claim to have received this kind of wisdom is the real deal, because it's a near miraculous solution to an impossible problem. Later on, his many wives will have an influence that is maybe not quite so positive. And today he meets another woman that you know very well, but you don't know her from her reputation. You know her from a piece of music written by Handel, and it's one you've heard at weddings many, many times, but you probably don't know the title of it. In fact, it was played at the first wedding ever done in the history of 360 Church. The song is called "The Arrival of the Queen of Sheba," and you may just hear it after the service today over the PA system. Prayers in private and prostitutes in public, that's one thing. But the queen seems to know, look, this guy is just the boss's son. The competition around him is weak. Let's see how he does when he's playing against the first team, when he's up against somebody else who is smart and powerful and savvy and who's come a long way. Now, Solomon's reputation begins about this big, but it becomes about that big, as we read. And the nature of that reputation is based on a lot of the decisions he made. It's funded by the wisdom that God has given him. But what is his secret? Have you wondered that when you've met someone who's extremely effective in what they do? And you look at that person and you say, what is it about them? What do they know that the people around them don't seem to know? The whole leadership literature industry is built around that question. Books and websites that give you the 10 secrets of this, the 9 principles of that, so you can be more effective. And as you look at Solomon, that's a pretty natural question to ask. Now, you could say, well, it was an administrative thing. He divided his nation into 12 regions with governors that he appointed, accountable only to him. And they gradually began to supplant the influence of the old 12 tribe system that the Israelites had arrived in Canaan with. And it gave him more direct control, accompanied by direct taxation, by the way. Or maybe it was his diplomatic skills. For the nations to his west, who were pretty powerful militarily, he negotiated treaties and trade agreements, secured the borders, got peace in our time there, and was very secure in a way, and the trade began to pump money into his economy. On the east, the military powers he faced were pretty weak, so maybe it was the military force that he used. Solomon created a massive standing army, lavishly endowed with every kind of equipment available in the ancient world. He was the first king of Israel to use cavalry in warfare, which is the equivalent of armored vehicles in our day. He employed these to attack the weaker powers to his east, Syria largely, where he secured additional property, additional wealth, and pulled all of that into his empire. But that's not really the secret either. Or you could look at architecture. The fact that he begins massive infrastructure projects that build up his country, that actually rebuild whole cities that create roads and the kinds of things we would think, bridges, interstate highway system in our day. His equivalent of those things, he builds all of that. He takes them from a group of people who used to be nomads who now don't wander around anymore into a group of people that really occupy and develop a nation. But that's not really it either. Then there's spirituality. He assembles a list of building materials and craftspeople too long to mention, and pulls these resources together, and he builds a temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. Now, this had been his father David's top priority, but God had not allowed David to do it. He allowed Solomon to do it. He builds this temple, brings the Ark of the Covenant, which is the most holy object of the Jewish faith, into the temple, and there's a huge celebration. God appears in a cloud, and there's prayer, and God promises to save and deliver the nation as long as they're faithful to him, and amazing stuff happens. This is really the day when he moves out from under David's shadow and becomes a king by his own right, but that's not really it either. What could be the geography of the situation? He's right on top of all the trade routes, as we mentioned, that run from the Arabian Peninsula in the south up into Egypt to the west, across the Mediterranean into the Roman Empire, and out into parts of the world that no one in Solomon's time or region had ever even visited yet. They didn't even have names for these parts of the world. And he is right on top of everything, which allows him to charge tolls for everyone who passes through his country. It's like owning the toll gates on the Bay and Golden Gate bridges. He just is parked right on top of that, but that's not really it either. Or it could be his technological prowess. Solomon develops the copper deposits in the Arabian Peninsula, has them mined and smelted by Phoenicians that he seemed to hire for everything he didn't want his own people to do. And remnants of those smelting locations have been unearthed by archaeologists. There are a number of them that have been found. He makes copper his major export, brought up from the Arabian Peninsula, brings it to Palestine, where he turns it over and resells it. This fuels more trade. Chariots come from Egypt, horses from Asia Minor, we would call that Turkey today, all fed into his economic system and all turned over and resold to other nations at prices that were not negotiable. And that's not really it either. Taken together, you could call Solomon's kingdom not Israel, but Solomon Incorporated. And the national anthem would be Ka-ching! This man had created an economic superpower using trade and military force in limited quantities to protect his economy, sucks in all the cash, turns it over, resells everything, brings it back in, and with a tremendous velocity for the ancient world, and uses all of that to fund personal projects like his massive palace, to the temple he builds for God, and all of the other kinds of military accoutrements that he would need. Everything that would go into making him famous internationally would come from this ka-ching factor of the economic system that he had set up. But there is one thing that made it all possible, his secret weapon: the domestication of the camel. During the time that Solomon reigns, the camel, which has been around for millions of years, is tamed and turned into a beast of burden for long-distance transport. Now, this sounds like not a big deal, but trust me, it is more important than the invention of the automobile has turned out to be in our society. These animals are perfectly adapted to carry large loads over huge distances in conditions that you would never even consider crossing. Well, they weigh about 1,500 pounds, but even at that weight, full on, a camel can run for 40 miles an hour. So if one's angry at you, you will not get away. Over long distances, they can go 25 miles per hour, and what makes them really valuable is not just the speed, but the fact that they can carry hundreds and hundreds of pounds of cargo. Some estimates are up to 800 and 900 pounds over incredibly difficult terrain. Now, these were so valuable in the ancient world for trade that they persisted in this form into the modern world. In fact, in the 19th century, the United States Army actually started a cavalry unit using camels instead of horses. That unit was based at Benicia, here in our area, and the enclosures where the camels were kept are still there. Now the Civil War sort of put the end to all of that, and the unit was decommissioned. The Romans used them as cavalry to patrol the edges of the desert to keep peace in their empire, because the things are just, well, they're just unique. There's just nothing like them. I mean, who's got the big nose and the hump, and who can go for 17 days with no water? Who can carry 900 pounds? What can run faster than my bicycle will ride and make it to the other end of the desert? The thing is absolutely incredible. And so what happens is these animals are strung together in long caravans, sometimes miles-long caravans, and they are able to haul cargo with a speed and a quantity that the ancient world had never seen before. Revolution is not too strong a word. And so they are hauling cargo up and down the Arabian Peninsula, north and south, and everywhere from there. And as a result, they are pumping wealth and power into whoever controls the caravan routes. And it is King Solomon who sits right on top of the major interchange where they all come together. These dromedary cargo vessels are the economic lifeline of his empire. They are the fuel lines of his economic machine, and because of them, he is able to do things that no one is able to do because of the iron law of the universe. Are you ready for this? Here's your tweet for the day. Here's the iron law of the universe. You can do what you can pay for. I'll give you that again because I know it's groundbreaking. You can do what you can pay for. If you can pay for it, you can do it. Why did Solomon do all of this stuff? Because he could pay for it. And he could pay for it because of camels driving so much trade into his country that he became an economic superpower on the humped back of these dromedary ships of the desert, as somebody calls them. Now, cleverly, he supplements the camel route with a sea lane of trade up and down the Red Sea with a fleet, an actual navy that he positions there. And he uses that to threaten the viability of the camel route, so everybody's forced to become more efficient. And no matter which way you go, by camel or by sea, he charges tolls one way, and he makes you hire his boats the other way for hefty prices, turning everything over when they finally reach their destination for prices that he does not negotiate. Solomon owed everything to God and the camel. Take one of them off of the table and none of it happens, because no matter how wise you are, you cannot do what you cannot pay for. And so he is able to pay, and he is able to do. But when you open trade routes, it's game-changing, because your culture is about to touch someone else's culture in a way that has never happened before. And it injects new variables into the situation, and you can't control where they go. For example, when European culture first met Native American culture on our continent a couple centuries ago, it was through trade routes, a lot of it by canoe and caravan, but not with camels. And as these goods and services were exchanged, they carried bacteria that wiped out 95% of Native Americans before they ever saw the first European face. So when cultures touch each other in this way, by camel caravan, by sea lane, there are great opportunities, but terrible risks, and no one knows where it goes when it starts. You get on the roller coaster, you go to the top of the hill, and you start down, and you can't tell how the destination is going to happen. And this is what takes place with the king as he forges down the sea lanes, down the desert lanes. He finds other people and other places, and everything changes. The Queen of Sheba may well have come to visit Solomon because she feared that his control of both the caravan lanes and the sea lanes was going to put a stranglehold on the economic vitality of her own empire. Most likely she's from the nation of Yemen. And that economy is built also, as Solomon's was, on trade. And if he has a death grip on both of those two trade arteries, he's able to simply put her out of business virtually overnight. And that kind of anxiety might be what put her on the back of a camel to ride the whole way to Jerusalem to see him. She is mentioned also in the Quran and in Ethiopian histories. There's excellent archaeological evidence of the prominence of queens in this part of the world at the time that the scripture talks about her visit there. Probably she learns about Solomon by talking either to the people who have been to Jerusalem on camel caravans or from sailors who have been part of his Red Sea fleet, Phoenicians he hired to man these vessels, who have come telling of a king who lives far to the north, who has an amazing palace, who has a massive army, who has huge cavalry, I mean thousands of troops, who has arranged peace treaties that are tricky and very, very beneficial, and who seems to be able to answer almost impossible questions, and who handles tricky situations with prostitutes and babies really, really well. These kinds of stories would have found her, and something piques her curiosity, and she probably is thinking, you know, this is where both the ships and the camels end up. Maybe I better go see this person, find out what's really going on. I mean, is he just the boss's son? Is he just prospering because nobody around him really has much going on in these 3 or 4 decades? Or is this a real threat to the welfare of what I'm doing in my particular part of the world? Now, ancient rulers frequently paid official visits to each other. This is a very common custom, and they would come in a polite way for diplomatic reasons, to just sort of get to know each other and find out what the issues might be between them, if there were things they needed to negotiate, and spend some time together, generally for the purpose of figuring out what the trade zones were going to be. You trade here, I'll trade there, and we'll call it good, and we'll eliminate any possibility of a conflict. So motivated by things like that, she rounds up every kind of gift she can carry. Remember, one camel can be 800 or 900 pounds, loads them all on a huge caravan, and heads for a 1,200-mile trip to Jerusalem. Now, one modern scholar who has ridden caravans in Mongolia in the 20th century discovered that they can make about 10 to 25 miles a day, depending on the weather, the conditions, and the degree of tiredness and fatigue and so forth. So if they're going 10 miles a day, this 1,200-mile trip on camelback is a long, brutal affair. That's how highly motivated she is to take the trip. And maybe she does it this way so that when the king and those in the city see the huge dust cloud in the distance generated by this long tail of camels stretching far, far, far over the horizon, as she gradually approaches, her arrival with her fabulous retinue and her garments and all the bling that would go along with being an ancient queen sends the message, we are not afraid of you and your sea trade. We think the camel thing works just great, and that's why I'm arriving on one of these and not in one of your boats. So perhaps the whole thing is a message. Here's the main feature of her visit, though. She comes to visit Solomon. He does not go to see her. His market value is higher than hers at this point. And so she goes to see him. And here's how the visit is portrayed in 1 Kings chapter 10, in verse 10. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his officials, and the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered in the house of the Lord, there was no more breath in her. The original language means the spirit went out of her. She saw the overwhelming impression that the king would make, his fabulous lifestyle, his amazing court. And in her mind, what she's thinking is, his cupbearer is so much better than my cupbearer back at home. It's really not a competition. And as she's overwhelmed by the amazing stuff that he possesses, her heart just goes, man, if these guys wanted to whip us, they just totally could. This is I mean, I have brought my best stuff here. Monarchs who made these kinds of visits were fond of a sort of a sport they played with each other, which was to test each other with riddles and hard questions. It was kind of an intellectual game that royalty would play, sort of like, fox hunting or equestrian sports later in history. And they would test one another with these parlor games to see, well, the only way to say it is to who's the coolest. I'll give you this riddle, and then you give me yours, and we go back and forth until somebody couldn't do it. And this was considered high entertainment among kings. And probably the queen is thinking, well, I'm just going to bring my regular stuff, and we're going to find out if he really has it or not. And when she had given him her best questions, her best riddles, her best everything, for Solomon, it's just a slam dunk. This is what we are. This is what we have. This is what I can do. She brings him lavish gifts, as diplomats and world leaders would today. She brings him the best of the intellectual culture of her nation, and none of it is able to compare to what Solomon's has, because Solomon's ability to see what needs to be done and how things need to be thought through has come from God. It's not just the camel. It's that plus the camel. It's all come from God, and she recognizes the source of it. Verse 6 picks up the story. And she said to the king, you almost have to read this with the breath gone out of you. Well, the report was true. I heard it in my own land of your words and of your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I came and my own eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpassed the report that I had. Happy are your men, happy are your servants, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. In other words, imagine what it's like to be with this guy and hear this kind of stuff every day. I mean, it's just outrageous. Happy is everybody who's going to have that happen. Verse 9 continues, Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold. That's 4.5 tons. That's a couple of cars. And a very great quantity of spices. Yemen was known for that. And precious stones. Never again came such an abundance of spices as these that the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And then verse 13 says, And King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all that she desired, whatever she asked besides what was given her by the bounty of King Solomon. So she turned and went back to her land with her servants. She has to admit that there's something unique here. And the other and more important thing she admits is that what's happened here, this has come from God. There's no natural explanation from this. This is a man who has humbled himself, realized that he does not have the ability to rule this great number of people, has gone to God and said, God, put in my mind what's necessary to make the right kinds of decisions so I can lead with justice and righteousness and mercy and in the way that you would want me to. And God just honors the humility of this guy's heart and pours all that stuff in him. And the queen, coming from afar with no particular affection for Solomon's God and no recognition of his religion and probably no background in his faith, simply sees what he is able to do and sees God in him. You know, if God is really active in your life through faith in his son Jesus, that it does things in you and people can see that on you. People can recognize the activity of God in your life. They can see in the way you conduct yourself, the way you make decisions, the way you make your choices. They can look at you and say, there's just something about you. There's just something, there's just something more there than can be explained. In your life, in your problems, in your hard questions, life brings them to you the way life brought the Queen of Sheba to Solomon. Ask God to show you the camel. somewhere in the situation, there's a camel. Something that makes all the other somethings work. Something that is the synergist, something that is the catalyst, something that drives everything. When we were on our way to come to Berkeley to start 360 Church, the biggest challenge that we probably faced was finding a place to live in this city. That still remains the largest challenge of the average person that I know who comes to the East Bay. The hardest part of being here is being here. And so we thought, what are we going to do? We felt like it was really important to be citizens of the town. If we were going to serve it, we should be part of it. I can't go to a city council meeting to ask for something and say, hi, I'm Earl, I'm from San Francisco. That's not really going to fly here. So we placed a high priority on that. And Jan, out of the blue, found a realtor who agreed to work with us. His name was Mike. And he talked to us on the phone. And he was, I think, a little skeptical at first because we were sort of like, start a church, you've got to be kidding me. We're coming from Missouri, you've got to be kidding me. Do you know what it costs out here? There's an extra zero on everything. You've got to be kidding me. And he was very nice, very professional. I'm not saying he said those things to us. I'm just saying that if I had been him, I would have thought about those things because it just, what we were trying to do just seemed so crazy. I mean, who wouldn't like to have a place to live in Berkeley? And we began the process of looking for a place. We toured the entire area. We've been in more homes than the police department, just checking them out, trying to find out. We lived online, looking for a place after place after place. And, there were places with bathrooms behind curtains, and there were sheds behind other sheds, and that were just falling down. That the termites would turn up their nose. They wouldn't eat it. The house, they were so nasty. Repossessed houses, abandoned houses, which was kind of in our price range at the time, in the depths of the recession. And ultimately, we were able to secure the house where we live now, one we had seen twice before, which we hated so much. We had walked away from it and never gone in. We bought it without ever looking at the inside as a repo abandoned from a bank. And looking back on that now, I thought the end of the story was the really important part for us, that it all sort of worked out. Isn't God good? And that's all really true. But Mike was our camel. He made a long trip carrying a lot of weight over terrain that, can I be honest with you, there are times when we gave up and he wouldn't let us. He would talk to us on the phone. This is going to work out. We're going to make this work. We're going to keep looking until we find you something. I know there's a house out for you. Mike's a believer in Jesus, and he just stayed with it, stayed with it, stayed with it, stayed with it. He wouldn't let us give up. Now, when the Queen of Sheba shows up at your door, I need to know that there's a camel out there someplace for me. There's some factor in my situation, some person who's going to be in it, something behind the scenes that is holding everything together. And that camel is that answer from God that I need for the problem I face, for the riddle that's come to me, for the challenge that life is brought to my door. God, what is it that you could bring into my life that could carry me a long distance over harsh terrain and that won't fail no matter what? I think there is, if you will, a camel for everybody who's seated in this room this morning. And whatever your Queen of Sheba has brought to you, that God's more than able to put into your life the answers that you need in exactly the timely fashion when you need them. This morning we're going to have an opportunity for us to ask the Lord for that, specifically for the things that are just really hard. Things that are just really hard. I'm going to ask you to stand with me if you would, please. Our band's going to come and lead us in a few more worship songs, and then we'll invite us forward for a time of taking communion together. While we're worshiping this morning, if you have something that you just need a solution for, just need an answer for it. Maybe you've been through all the conventional answers, you've tried all the likely stuff. As we're singing, just open your heart and ask the Lord to give you that one thing, the one thing that will change it all. To just drop that into your heart, or allow you to meet the person who could bring that into your life. As we sing this morning, if you'd like to pray with someone about that, we'll have some people up here at the front. That'll be great. We'd love to do that with you, or you can just stay where you are and just open your heart to the Lord. Let's believe God that what he gave to this king is still around, and it's available to us here this morning.